So I mentioned Tim's name. He's going to be up here in a minute. It's Tim Chesser. He retired from the First Baptist Church of Delaware, Ohio, so he does sound a little different than we do. A little kind of accent, I think. I don't know. It's not a Rhode Island accent, that's for sure. Well, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, so really he has, okay. So he's been ministering there since 1978, but as of late, he's been an interim pastor at Phillips and Oak Lawn churches in Rhode Island. So,
I will say if the children were going to be here, I would ask about this because I was curious. That's our pastor. Okay. Well, let me begin by saying I'm grateful to be here. I retired in 2014, and since then I've had 4 interims ranging in distance from 6 months to 2 years. And so I've been busy, and after the last one, my wife assured me that it was time for me to retire. But so I'm allowed 1 Sunday a month to go and still ply my trade, as it were, which is to be able to preach. My text today is found in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew writes these words. While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly, a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and he took her by the hand, and the girl got up. I'm almost feel like I'm shut off from you, and I'm tempted to come here. But my wife warns me that sometimes when I start wandering like this, not only do my feet wander, but my mind wanders as well. This is a story of interruptions. This past week, I got one of those unexpected interruptions that you would think wouldn't be a big deal, but it kind of is. I was watching Jeopardy, as I always do at 7:30 at night, and we're coming right up to Final Jeopardy, and all of a sudden CBS breaks in and says, "Breaking news, breaking news." And then in what should have been able to be handled in 3 sentences at most, they kind of talk for a while. And then amazingly enough, they're through in time for their own programming and their own commercials for the rest of the night. So they took away my enjoyment of Final Jeopardy, made their little presentation, and then got back to what? Business as usual. Well, if that had only happened once in a lifetime, it wouldn't be a big deal. But Jeopardy is often interrupted for things that are not as important as Jeopardy. Or that's kind of how I think about it. The text before us today, if you're a lectionary preacher, which I am, which means I follow through a 3-year pattern of preaching through the whole Bible, and this year it happens to be Matthew. And just before this, and the lectionary has a tendency to have a little bit, leave out a little bit, put a little bit more in. I'm not exactly sure why, but sometimes the things they leave out are just as important as the things they put in. But in this case, Jesus had been having dinner, as it were, with some unsavory types. Now, we're good Baptists, so when we eat together, we're usually not eating with unsavory types, as far as we know, because we don't know what the rest of you have been up to during the week. We don't know about the people that you might bring in. And one thing we know for sure, if there's any unsavoriness there, we want to keep it well hidden in our pocket or in our coat or somewhere, because when we come here, we want to put our best face forward. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But in Jesus' day, the Pharisees saw that he was eating with these people and said, this ought not to be. And Jesus says, I'm just going to ignore you. And so they were to him an interruption. But then he's going to move on to another kind of interruption, because then there's another little interlude, and that has to be left out lest I go 45 minutes rather than 30 minutes. Although I will tell you, I never know exactly how long a sermon is going to last, but I know this is a good Baptist church because I looked over there and go, oh, there's the clock. Nice big letters there. At Phillips, the clock was so far away I could not see it. So I never worried about that at all. So Jesus is on the road. Now, when Jesus is on the road, it's not like when we're on the road. We get in our cars, we turn on the GPS, tell us how to get here. I checked before I came here, and there were 3 different ways I could have gotten here. The quick way, the way with no expressway, and I forget what the third one was. So I decided to go the quick way because that's what my car told me to do. Haven't we really come somewhere when we go where our car tells us to go? We should be going where Jesus tells us to go, and somehow we give over power to our cars. But nonetheless, I went the quick way, and so I got here without any difficulty. And when I leave here, I'm going to go somewhere different because our church, that is the church where my son is pastor, is having an on-the-grounds picnic this afternoon. So I know there will be all kinds of good food to go to there. So as Jesus traveled, though, he drew a crowd. And people crowded around because they wanted to hear what he had to say. And so as he's traveling one day, a leader of the synagogue, according to Matthew. According to Mark and Luke, the leader of the synagogue has a name. I've always found it interesting when I compare the different Gospels, the things they add or the things they take away. Matthew is only concerned with the 2 acts that are going to take place here. He's not overly concerned with the people behind them. He's not concerned with the names they have. But when Luke tells a story like this, he wants to give as much human detail as there was, the human interest aspect of the story. So we know the person's name. Now, you may have heard it before, but I don't know that you heard it sound exactly like this. I call him Jairus. My son, who was born in Wisconsin, and so he didn't benefit from getting our lovely accent as he grew up. He still speaks sometimes with clipped notes of a Wisconsinite, but occasionally, living with Mom and Dad, who both grew up in Georgia, he will still lean over that way. Occasionally, I will pronounce the name of somebody in the Bible, and he will gently remind me afterwards, there is another pronunciation of that. With our kids, you just have to kind of get used to what they do. And when they start getting old enough to correct us, it's like, When my son was in seminary, he was taking a course on 1 Corinthians. And he was telling me about it, and I said, that's great. I've got the definitive work on 1 Corinthians. He kind of paused for a minute, and he looked at me and said, well, Dad, that may have been true 30 years ago, but they've done some work on it since then. All right, well, they've done some work on me in those 30 years too. Things have changed. So according to Luke, this is Jairus, who was a leader of the synagogue. Who was the person that you said was the president? Raise your hand. Right here. Here's the president. That would be equivalent to Jairus' role in the synagogue. He's like the president. He's not the rabbi, but he's in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly, and he's a person of high repute, as I'm sure you are as well, or you would not have risen to such a lofty position in the Baptist world. See, I'm old school when we still had moderators who were in charge of the church. We didn't have presidents and vice presidents. Times change. The job's probably the same as it was. So Jairus comes to him and says, Master, my daughter is dying, and if you will but come and lay hands on her, she will live. And so Jesus decides to, rather than going where he was going, which neither Matthew, Mark, or Luke tells us, he decides to go with Jairus to his home. And as he's walking along, a woman who had been, the way the scripture puts it, mistreated by the medical establishment of the day. Now, the medical establishment of the day is not what we think of medical establishment today. But we still know what it's like sometimes to be mistreated by the medical establishment. My wife recently had to have a prescription filled, and when I went in for the first 30-day dose, the kind lady at CVS said, "Now I need to let you know that the copay on this is $120. Well, okay. We trust her doctor. We trust that she needs this medication. And as it turns out, it solved the problem she had. So at the end of that, then we get a text from CVS. You have another prescription. So we go, and now it's 3 months. And the girl said, "Do you know about copay?" And I said, "Well, I knew the last one, and I was hoping we were about to meet our deductible, but au contraire." So $360 for 3 months. Well, by this time, I wised up a little and thought maybe I better get online and see if there are any discounts available. And I found out that if I'd used a good RX card, which I thought was just a promotion, I didn't know you could really save money with it, I could have gotten that $120 medicine for $32.95 at Stop and Shop. Now, I consider that being harassed by the medical institution. I don't know. Not very good as far as I can tell. And if you ever find yourself needing ongoing medical care, you know there are all kinds of things that can happen. I'm fortunate, and I didn't tell you this detail so you wouldn't know, I'm also a veteran. I spent 4 years in the Coast Guard as an enlisted man, and then I received a direct commission from President George W. Bush as a chaplain in the United States Army Reserves, where I served for 4 years and then went to a church in Oklahoma, and I just couldn't keep up with both, so I had to give up my commission. But I am eligible for VA health care, so thank you very much for paying for my health care. Because nothing is free in life except grace itself. And grace is also what this story is about. So this woman who had an issue of some sort, and the Bible doesn't go into a whole lot of detail about it, but it was obviously affecting her life. And she comes and says, "If I can just touch the hem of his garment." Now, commentators will tell us that that's probably the prayer fringe on the edges of his cloak, which was common for Jewish men of the time. And so she reaches out and she touches his garment. And Matthew says, and she was instantly healed. All that time she had spent with doctors didn't get the job done, but she was instantly healed when she touched Jesus' garment. Now in Luke, who again wants to give us a more full story, Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples say, "Lord, look at this crowd." This is like being at let's say a Patriots game, and you get touched by somebody as you're going through the concourse. Well, you can look around, you don't know who touched you. Sometimes then you reach for your wallet to make sure they didn't take it, but I don't know if that happens in New England or not. No pickpockets allowed. Whenever I'm in New York City in Times Square, I always put my wallet in this pocket and I keep my hand in my pocket all the time. That's kind of how they can tell you're a tourist. And so then they try to steal your phone. I used to carry my phone on a little thing here, but then I got away from doing that because why? My son made fun of me. He said, "Dad, only old people wear." Son, guess what? I am. I am an old person. And so the disciples say, how can you know? And then Jesus turns and he sees this lady. She becomes the center of attention for a moment. Everybody's looking back from others in the crowd. What's going on up there? See, isn't that kind of what we do when there's a crowd gathered around somewhere? We wonder, what is going on up there? Not too long ago, my wife and I were coming back from somewhere, and as we looked up ahead, we saw all kinds of flashing lights, and there was an apartment complex just up the street from us, and there'd been a fire there. Well, when you have a fire in an apartment building, you attract an awful lot of attention. There were a lot of fire trucks and a lot of ambulances and a lot of police cars there. We later found that there were no serious injuries, but it was a fairly serious fire. So my wife said, let's just ride by there, see if we can see what's going on. I'm usually the curious one, so I thought it was a victory that she's the one that wanted to go see what was going on. So everybody is looking, and the woman, frankly, based on the way the story comes to us, she's nervous. Have I done something wrong? Did I do something wrong? And Jesus says, paraphrasing, no worries. Your faith has made you whole. She didn't even have to ask. Now, when I titled this sermon, which I thought was going to be on the screen with all sorts of other things, that must be the technical difficulties.
No, it was. It was up on the screen.
Oh, was it?
Oh, yeah, before you saw it.
Oh, I see.
Kaylee, you want to throw that first slide?
No, not necessary. I'm just saying, it looks like that I've gone black. So I was just concerned that the people in the back said, no, we don't want this going out. No, it's fine. Don't allow. Very good. Oh, a nice little icon there to go with it. Now I'm really off track. Jesus was getting ready to do a big-time miracle. I must have shown signs of running out of energy. Thank you very much. One of the things I love about going to different churches to preach in is to see how they treat you and how things are handled. And y'all are getting an A+ up to this point. I bet you don't hear that too often. Y'all are getting them. That's a common Southern expression. And by the way, it's always plural. Y'all is not an individual. It's always more than one. So Jesus is getting ready to do something extremely important. A big-time miracle. And this, let's face it, given all the things that he did, it's kind of a almost routine ho-hum sort of thing. Well, that's not how we would look at it today, but in Jesus' day, this sort of thing happens around him all the time. Now, the one person that I think might have been upset was Jairus. Lord, remember I came to you. My daughter's dying. I need for you to come. And so Jesus allows for this interruption. He heals this woman who has been suffering for decades, it sounds like. And then he turns his attention back to Jairus. Then they go on to his house. And the light was there bad because sometimes I have age-related macular degeneration. They have so many different terms they can use for what happens to you when you get old. And so I struggle with it, and I'm at the point of getting shots in my eye. And let me tell you, that's an experience when you're just sitting there and somebody's coming at you with a needle. But really, the anticipation of it is worse than the other thing. But I think it said the party that was there. Well, there were hired groups that would come and put on a show of sorrow when there had been a death in a household. And so the neighbors were gathered around, and the professional mourners were there. And essentially they said to Jesus, you might as well go wherever it was you're going because his daughter has already died. And Jesus said, you're the one that need to go wherever you are going because she's fine. And Jesus comes in, and indeed she has died. And he lays hands on her, and he said, now Matthew doesn't give you this part, but essentially he says, arise. He says it in Aramaic. It's one of the few places in the New Testament, as we have it, that we know it was in Aramaic. Talitha, arise. And she gets out of bed, and she has been restored to life. Now, for Matthew, that's it. That's the end of the story. But Luke, who I love, Luke just is my favorite for a lot of different reasons. Maybe you don't know that you're allowed to have favorite gospels. But you are. They speak to you. You have favorite other books, don't you? Who reads the Brothers Karamazov regularly when they could be reading Garfield? I don't know. Plug in whatever it is that you think. You're allowed to have a favorite book of the Bible, and you're allowed to have a least favorite book of the Bible. My favorite is Luke. My least favorite probably is Leviticus, but that's just because I struggle to get through it sometimes. In Luke, she rises and Jesus says, get her something to eat. Get her something to eat. In other words, she's back. She's alive. You need to do for her the things that you would do for anybody else. You need to get her something to eat. Now, I'm still learning funeral traditions here. I learned a new word when I first went to Phillips, and that word was collation. I thought that had to do with putting pages in order. I had never heard that word until I moved here. And when I went to Phillips, a week before I started, I got a call, would you do a funeral when you first get here? And it was a funeral down at the Point. And then they said, we're having a collation afterwards. Collation? I wonder what that is. Well, through the miracle of Google, I knew it meant food. What do we do after a funeral? We come and we break bread together, because that's when we share our memories. We can share what people meant to us. Now, in this case, though, they weren't having to share memories. They were celebrating something new. A daughter that they thought they had lost had been given back to them. The puzzling thing for us, or at least it's puzzling for me. Lots of times things puzzle me that don't puzzle other people. The puzzling thing for me is, what do we do with that story now when we're dealing with people who have sick children? Because the fact of the matter is, Jesus doesn't raise very many sick children up from the dead anymore. I mean, let's be honest, it just doesn't happen very much. But He promises that He will never abandon us and He will always be with us. And I've come to find out that sometimes we have to modify our own thinking. We have to modify that which we're willing to ask. Jairus was willing to ask because he knew, or at least had heard enough about Jesus, that he thought that a miracle was possible. And a miracle is what was given. And because of that miracle, and because of other miracles, we know the story of Jesus today. Sometimes we have to think about how we pray. This past weekend, this sermon begins and ends with an interruption, for those of you who are keeping up and have hope. But I will tell you that I've often told people this was it, and then it turns out another thought came to me. But there's another interruption. Last Sunday, we were at Warwick Central, as we always are, and my wife tends to sometimes be a little cold in church, so I looked over several times and I thought, she just doesn't look like she feels too good, and I would ask numerous times, no, I'm okay. So we came home that afternoon, and she's had some breathing issues over the years, and she was, after lunch, she looked like she was feeling pretty good. Well, then supper comes around, and after supper, she started feeling a little worse, and I kept going in and checking on her, and I said, are you okay? Do we need to do anything? And so I was praying. Now, I didn't just pray that her breathing problems go away. We've prayed about that enough times because we are concerned about it. But my prayer was, Lord, give us the wisdom to know what to do. Well, that was more for me than her, because she was on her own figuring this out. So I would check on her several times, and it was a little struggle, but it was like, she said, well, I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow. It'll be fine. And about 10:45, she called to me, and she said, I can't breathe. Well, that'll get your attention in a hurry. I said, do you want me to take you to the emergency room or call 911? And she says, call. And so I called, and the Cranston's faithfullest were there within just a few minutes. And she said afterwards, she said, I felt better when I saw them walk in the room, because I knew there was somebody who would know what they were doing, which of course means I didn't. But the fact of the matter was, I didn't. I had no idea what to do. We've had little episodes over the years, but never anything to this degree. So they loaded her up, and so immediately they have questions. What hospital do you want to go to? Well, I've only been in Rhode Island now for a little over 2 years, but I keep my ears open. And sometimes when people go to Kent Hospital, they say, and so her primary care physician is right across the street from Rhode Island, so I said, take her to Rhode Island Hospital. So they're loading her up. I called my son Sam, and he said, you want me to meet you there? I said, why don't you just come here and we'll go together. He regretted that decision later when we were still at the hospital at 5:30 the next morning. Said I should have just driven. But I knew he would want to be there, and I knew it was important for her, so he came, and then we rode up there. When you present in the hospital with breathing issues, they immediately jump into action. There's a lot of things to do, lots of tests and stuff. It turns out she had a pulmonary embolism. Now, in my mind, my prayer was answered. I said, God, give us the wisdom to make the decisions we need to make. So the decision I made, when she said call, I immediately went and got my phone and called, because that's all I could do at the time. There wasn't anything else I could do. I was, in a very real sense, she was in the same position as this woman. She had an issue that had to be dealt with that she struggled with for a long time, but she got help. Now, she's still got a ways to go. She's home from the hospital. She freed me up to come here today. I would have hated to call George in Kansas or wherever it is. I hate to tell you this, George, but I'm not able to come. A month or so ago, I was supposed to be preaching in Connecticut. And I woke up and I had a terrible cough. And it turns out I had COVID. How did I get COVID, you might ask? See, you thought the sermon was over, and all of a sudden it's not. I had gotten a call from a former church member at the United Church in Stonington, Connecticut, where I was for 2 years, and said she had a friend who really needed a pastor for a funeral. And it's going to be held at the Coast Guard Academy. Well, I was an enlisted man, but the Coast Guard Academy, well, that sounds kind of high and mighty. And so I went and essentially, I'll be honest with you, I emceed a funeral service. I've never done one quite like that, but nonetheless, that's what the widow needed at that moment. And then there was a reception at the Mast Island Yacht Club. A room a little bit smaller than this, packed with people eating and drinking and talking. And somebody there had COVID and passed it on to me. And so I had to call them and say, but there are 2 women there, both named Lisa, by the way, that tag teamed and did the sermon in my absence. Because that's what ought to be able to happen. Ken should be able to step in at any moment and do a sermon. I forget what your name is. Jim should be able to step in and do a sermon. Well, you don't have to go on and on and on like a guest preacher might, but any of you ought to be able to step in. So out of this story, I take whole lots of different things. Jesus freely allowed interruptions. You see, sometimes we want our life so ordered that we never get interrupted by anything. It is my nature to allow interruptions because I love people and I love to talk. I came home once from Stop and Shop and I was telling my wife, I said, I had this conversation with a guy in line at Stop and Shop. And she said, well, how did that get started? I said, it wasn't me. I said, he started it. And she said, are you sure? And I said, well, I might have said whatever it was that got the conversation started. And so we got to talking. My wife says I'm the world's worst about this. If I'm out, I'm talking to people, knowing people's names. A number of years ago, I had to have open heart surgery, and one of the cashiers at ShopRite in Norwich, where we were living at the time, was concerned about me. And my son said, how does she even know you were having heart surgery? I said, well, it just came up in conversation. These things happen. So I know that Jesus has allowed me to interrupt. Lord, I need help. I need your wisdom to make a decision. We need this. We need that. We are concerned about the things that are going on in the world. So I'm thankful, and I want to encourage you to not think about interruptions, but think about possibilities to show love to those that you encounter. Now, I have completed my task here today, and my hope whenever I come to do pulpit supply is to not say anything that the pastor has to deal with when he comes back the next week. So I hope I've been successful in that. And I hope as you think about the days ahead and what's coming for you, be open for the unexpected, because we never know where it is we're going to meet God. And so now